Hey class, we're back. Now in this video, let's cover some CSS basics. So to begin, we wrote a little bit of JavaScript and we output hello world to the console in our first video. In the second video, we learned how to write tags in HTML. And in this video, we're going to learn how to write some basic CSS. So let's start off by resizing our tabs so that we have the CSS tab as the biggest one on the screen. So looking at the web page that we have so far, it's looking pretty good. We've got an H1, we have a paragraph, an image, another paragraph, and a horizontal rule. Okay, so the way that CSS works is we write a totally different language and we use it to just change the presentation of our HTML. So just think about it for a second. Why is hello world like this? Like, why does it look like this? Why is it this big and over here on the side? Why is there space around it? Like, why is it bold? This isn't bold. Why is this one bold? So we just have text and it looks like it's kind of the same font, although this one is bold while the words down here are not. Clearly there's different spacing, different sizing. Oh, and the color is black text and the document has a white background. So those are all choices that, you know, the computer didn't make on its own. These are the default appearance settings for these tags that's just built into the browser. And, you know, in theory, like different browsers could display things differently with their with their own settings, but in general they all kind of follow very similar rules. In CSS, the syntax looks different than HTML, so I'm just going to uncover my H1 so that we can see it. And I see the code that we use to mark up the hello world, the words hello world, is right here. It's just the letter H and the number 1. So for CSS, what I'm going to do is start by writing a selector. So this is basically a rule set that is going to override the default settings that are just built into the browser. So we start off with H1 just like that. And then I'm going to put a little space here. CSS is another one of those languages that doesn't care if you use extra space. So we will usually use it just to make our code a little bit more readable by other people, by yourself too, because, you know, in a month you come back to this, you're gonna have to read through your code and understand what you were doing and what you were writing. And CSS is one of those languages that, even though we're going to do some basic stuff today, it can blow up real fast. So it's nothing to write 1,000 lines of CSS for a website. Okay, so the next symbol that we're going to write is a little funny because we don't normally write it in English, but it looks like this, and you can find it next to the letter P on your keyboard. Just press Shift and then that key, and it creates this thing called a curly bracket. At least that's what we call it around here. I've read that it's called other things in other places. I've heard it called a brace or even a curly brace, but it's usually just called a curly bracket. And it kind of works like parentheses in that when you open one, you have to close one. Okay, so in programming, we usually use curly brackets to encapsulate or enclose a block of code. And that's kind of what we're doing here, although CSS is a little different. It's kind of its own thing. So when I press enter here, this is again just so that my code is a little bit more readable. I'm going to list all the properties that I want to change, and then I'm going to list their new values. And I can do that by just writing it out. Now, I know what the properties are called, but you kind of have to look this stuff up. You can't just make them up, and it's not something that, I mean, you could guess, but the Mozilla Developer Network is a really awesome resource for all things web development. But for beginners, I still like pointing people to w3schools.com. I think that it's super easy to use. The website is really easy to navigate, and there's tons of great examples. The key is, you know, if you see something that looks really complicated and you can't figure out how it works, just maybe take a break from that and find something simpler until you're ready for the more complicated stuff. Like you can build some really interesting things with CSS, and you should totally experiment with that. But you always want to try to understand the things that you're building so that you can learn how others build these projects and then make it your own. Learn how to write that code on your own and to modify it to suit your needs. Okay, so anyway, that's enough lecture for now. Let's get into changing the colors. So hello world, I said the color of the text is black. So there's a property called color, and I can just write color, and then I'm going to use a colon, and on the other side of the colon, I'm going to write the new color for my text. And I'm just going to use a built-in color, red, and then at the end of my line, I'm going to put a semicolon. It's very common in programming languages to sort of end a statement with a semicolon. And so just get into that habit now with CSS. At the end of your line, put a semicolon and then run your code. And this hello world should change to red. And there it is, it does. I can change other properties, so I can press return and I can list more properties and more values. So let's change the size of the text. So that property is called font-size. Now font size is 2 words. It's not a compound word, but CSS is like other languages. You can't have a space separating these 2 things because the computer will interpret it as 2 separate things. So the way that they deal with that in CSS is usually with a dash. This is kind of funny because most languages you can't do that. You would use an underscore or you would capitalize the next word. But here in CSS we use a dash. Okay, and now when we specify a size in CSS we have to specify units. So I'm going to make this 12 pixels or px, which is the abbreviation for pixels, and I'm going to run it. Now you can see that hello world is small. It's actually smaller than my paragraph text. But hey, I forgot to do the semicolon, so what's up with that? I don't need a semicolon on the last rule in my CSS rule set, but I recommend just adding it all the time because look, now if I want to make another change, if I want to add another property, so I press enter and let's say font weight normal, it's not going to change anything. In fact, my font size went back to the larger font size. So this didn't just affect line 4, it affected line 3 as well. Basically, it broke both of these rules. So I've got to remember to add in that semicolon, and if I just add it while I'm writing, then it's a mistake that a lot of beginners make, and it'll save you a little bit of time debugging on the back end if you just sort of make it your habit. There's lots of tools that you can get into later on when you're more advanced that kind of automate this kind of stuff, like not adding the semicolons, but like cleaning it up and minifying it and maybe even deleting extra semicolons that you didn't need. The sky's the limit with that kind of stuff, and it's out there, but in the beginning we're just trying to form good habits and recognize patterns in the code so that we can emulate them, we can take control of them, we can write them ourselves, and we can understand how these patterns work to achieve the results that we want. Okay, so this changed the H1. And if I had another H1 on the page, so let me go ahead and write another H1 in my HTML, and we'll just say hi. Oh, I wrote an H2 by mistake, so let me fix that. So now I have 2 H1s, and I'm going to run this, and they should both be red, 12 pixels, and the font weight is set to normal. Okay, so how can I just change one of these? So the H1 rule says take all of the H1s on the document and change them change them to look like this now. Okay, but if I wanted to only change the first one, this is where this class attribute comes in. So I had given it a special class name of special heading or special dash heading, and I use the dash because, hey, look at this. That's how CSS works. I could have done a different technique here, but I just try to keep it consistent. Okay, so how can I reference this element by the class name? I can do that by just changing the selector. Instead of h1, I can write special dash heading, and now right now it's trying to select a tag with this name, and we don't have a tag like that. It doesn't exist in HTML. So I need to tell the browser that I'm looking for specifically a class called special heading, and to do that I add a little period in front of it. So this is the syntax in CSS to select a class and make changes just to a class of elements. So let's run this. And what we have now is hello world has my special properties, but the word hi does not, even though they're both H1s. Now there's lots of rules that say like, okay, this is how, you know, when you have a conflict, when you have two rules that collide, this is how they're resolved. And you're going to discover that as you start writing CSS. Like you might have this class applied to a different thing. So let's say class equals special heading. Okay, so there we go. We've got two HTML tags with this class, and if I run it, they should both receive these styling rules, and they do. So the H1 is up here, and now the P tag is right here, and they both kind of look the same. They have different spacing because they haven't changed the margin, but for the most part, they've applied this. It has applied these rules to both of those elements, even though they're different elements. So now down here, if I take and I write a selector for the P tag, and I say color green, what will happen? I've changed the color to red, but now I'm saying make the color green. Let's run it. So my favorite potato, that turned green, but my favorite cookie did not. And so that's because we created a collision, and the browser has rules to determine how to resolve these things. And because special heading is more specific, because it's referring to a class, while the P element here, the P tag, the P selector, is referring to a tag. It's a little bit more generic. It resolved the color red. And that's even though this rule comes after the first one. So there's a lot to keep straight in your head when you're writing CSS, and it's easy to get confused. So just take a deep breath and learn how to debug CSS. And every time you resolve a conflict, just realize that you are growing as a developer, and you're learning more about CSS. It's just helping create the mental model that you need to write CSS successfully on your own. Okay, so debugging. How do we debug CSS? Like earlier, when I deleted the semicolon, I had a problem where my rule wasn't being applied. And Codepen isn't telling me that I have an error here. So how do I know that something's wrong? Well, I could look at it, but maybe, you don't realize that something broke, and later on you're like, oh, wait a minute, this doesn't look right. Now you've got to go through all of your code. And remember, I said it's easy to write like 1,000 lines of CSS. You can get real deep in the weeds before you start debugging. So let me show you how I debug CSS. Okay, up here in the view, the change view option, this is where we changed our panel layout to the different stacked versus horizontal. But I've got other choices down here, and I'm running the pro version of Codepen, so I have access to some of these features that you don't if you have a free account, but we all have this debug mode. If I click debug mode, it's going to open up my page in its own tab. So here we have the Codepen, the original Codepen, and over here I have this URL for the HTML page that's just running sort of by itself without the editor. And then here I can inspect the elements. So this is what inspect is for. It opens up the developer tools, and in the developer tools I can see all the elements that are in my document, and I can see this stuff here like, hey, these tags are not in Codepen, right? Like I didn't see those over there. I didn't write them, but Codepen includes these for us. And at some point we'll learn, what these things are and what all of this is and how to create a really well-formed HTML structure. Okay, but first we just need to learn the basics. And on the right hand side I can see I've got styles, so I can see the styles that are being applied to things. So if I inspect this hello world, I can see right here I've got a problem. So it says invalid property value, and remember I said that CSS is one of those languages that doesn't care about extra spaces. So when I pressed enter after the 12px without having the semicolon, it didn't know that I was ending my statement. Even though I pressed enter, it was assuming that this whole thing was the value that I was trying to place for the font size, which is an invalid value. So if I go ahead and add the semicolon, or let me just fix the value here, I'll just delete that. Now it's working, and I can see that my font size is small. Now my other rule, it got deleted, but at least I could identify what was happening, what was wrong with it. The other neat thing is when I hover over these elements, I can see like these little highlights, and what that is the let me select the word high here. I can see the size of the block for high. I can see the margin, which is what that little orange thing is. If there were padding, I could see that, and if there was a border, I would be able to highlight that as well. So let me go back into exploring JavaScript, and let's add some to that stuff. So on special heading, let's fix this. I'm actually going to change this to 72 pixels. Whoa, that's too big. 72. And then I'm going to add padding, and we'll just set it to 10 pixels. And then we'll change the margin to, why not? Margin to 15 pixels. Okay, so now we got padding and margin. Now last, let's add a border. So border is the property, and this is a funny one because it needs 3 values in order to actually render the border. It needs the thickness of the border, so I'm going to put, I'll put 6px, and then it needs the style of the border, so I'm going to just do a space and write solid. So it's a solid line, and then a space, and then I'm going to finally put the color. So let's make it green, and then I'm going to end my line or end my statement there. It's called a rule with a semicolon. So these are 3 different values, but they're going to be applied to my border property. So let me save it. Okay, it's been saved, and I can run it here to make sure that everything looks good. There it is. And this is on special heading, so it's being applied to the P tag and the H1. Okay, and now I can go over to my debug window, and I can refresh the page, and okay, there it is. Now if I hover over the special heading, I can see that there's these different little boxes here that are highlighted, and then by interacting with it in the computed section, I can sort of hover over just the box, then I can see the padding, then I can see the border, and finally I can see the margin. This is really handy when you're dealing with layout. Layout is like one of the trickier things to when you're learning CSS, and it's critical obviously to make good design, good web design. You have to have a good handle on page layout. So learning how to debug those kinds of problems is just very important, and that's what this is. That's what the dev tools are for. So this is how we would interact with the dev tools to try to debug our CSS. Okay, so we wrote kind of a lot of CSS already, and we've got some properties and some values. And I'm going to take a break there. We've learned how to select a class versus an element. There's tons of stuff we can do with CSS. Just scratching the surface, learning the basic patterns. So again, we can start to get used to writing that. And remember, the w3schools.com is an excellent resource. If you want to get really super advanced, check out csstricks.com. That's an awesome website with tons of resources and really great articles about best practices with CSS and with different design models. So you can learn some neat tricks there. I guess that's why they call it CSS tricks. Anyway, that's all I got for now. See you in the next video. Thanks.